that the one-drop notion came into law in full force in Virginia, efforts to categorize people racially according to blood quantum were long-standing, even as the courts recognized that physical appearance and family relationships came to bear on one's placement within the white-black divide. Even as it was restrictive and arbitrary, 1866 legislation in Virginia allowed some degree of wiggle room in its blood quantum theory, defining as it did a, quote, colored person as someone who had, quote, 1/4 or more Negro blood, end quote, and defining, quote, Indian people in the same manner, using 1/4 as a fraction. At first, this meant that people who might otherwise be categorized as black or indigenous could pass as white if they had less than 1/4 of blood that ostensibly belonged to their race. At the same time, this last specified that once an individual could be categorized as black within the legal system, they could not qualify as Indian. While racial identity law would change again in 1910 to lump more people in as black, it was not until 1924 that the Virginia legislature codified a very strict interpretation of whiteness within blood quantum theory. Whereas ordinary white citizens decided race based on stereotypical physical appearance, the government had seen indigenous people differently, because it decided whether someone was indigenous based on whether they had certified indigenous kin to which these individuals could point. In general, white people in Virginia thought that any intermingling with black people made someone black, and they tended to collapse any mixed racial identities into blackness. For the part of the federal government, one's racial identity could invite an entire investigation. Walter Plecker, a government official who served in the Bureau of Vital Statistics and was a staunch eugenicist, was aided by the state government in passing the 1924 legislation. But Plecker was going to press his agenda, even without the support of ordinary Southerners. Indeed, even local officials were reluctant to carry his plan out. Plecker knew that the enforcement of the 1924 legislation, particularly the invasive investigation of the race of individuals, would be difficult for local officials to enforce, as some of them might not like the confrontation that would accompany this job. But Plecker pushed the order forward anyway, and complained of local officials who did not inquire enough into the identities of people of color and thus allowed them to register as white on official documentation. Plecker saw mixed-race people as the most important to sort out. He used the word sort out, and as problems to be solved and to be categorized. It was this eugenics proposition about the fear of immigrants intermingling with one another and white people that was harbored by these men, and brought the blood quantum law of single drop in 1924, which, when passed, actually required a much larger threshold of, quote, Indian blood than in the original petition. By the way, the 1924 legislation did start as a petition. It is worth remembering that not only was the legislation enforced in inconsistent ways, but that Plecker's attempts to gatekeep whiteness aggressively was a mission that he undertook almost by himself, and without the support of other politicians, making his reign of terror truly a tyrannical one, rather than an effort of white Virginians in general. Although Plecker certainly did tap into their fears of replacement in his job. Whatever his intentions, however, the practical implementations of the one-drop rule of blood quantum quickly showed up the legislation, because in court cases of couples convicted or accused of interracial union, it quickly became clear that it was difficult to ascertain the racial identity of one's ancestors using data that simply identified them as colored, which could signify African Americans or indigenous people. The legislation at one point seemed so ridiculous that a lower court threatened to overturn it, and it was the result of punishing families that were accused of interracial sex that the banning of interracial marriage was overturned in the 1967 Loving v. Virginia decision. Not only was the blood quantum legislation harmful, but it was also unfair on many levels, part of which owed to its inconsistent enforcement. So much power did Plecker have that he often didn't adhere to his own rules, because he consulted local white people to corroborate the claims of the Chickahominy about their ancestors, which seemed like an unscientific move when held up against the presence that one's race could be ascertained objectively, since what would be the need of consulting local white populations about race if all you needed was ancestry? Plecker, along with two other of his henchmen, Cox and Powell, tried to pass laws that were similar to that in Virginia and other states, including in D.C. and Texas. What brought about the 1924 legislation was how, quote, Virginians moved from a rural to urban community. These three men, namely Plecker, Cox, and Powell, saw in that mobility potential threats to the proper racialized classification of Virginia's citizens. But Plecker, along with Powell and Cox, also held that, quote, there were no real Indians in Virginia, that is to say, native people with no black ancestors, and so they attempted to render Native American Virginians as black. Perhaps worried about the interracial mingling that might occur inside of industrial centers, Powell, Cox, and Plecker attempted to make the rules stricter and to have federal government oversight over this eugenics process. For these three men, they worried about the passage of native Virginians into whiteness, for fear that, quote, their appearance cloak, their black blood might more easily blend into the white population, and thus white people could not tell the difference between them, racially speaking. Because white settler society in Virginia was so fixated on a division between black and white people and the preservation of white purity, the main fear of the eugenicists was a possibility that the, quote, black blood transferred to native children through interracial sex would remain latent inside of indigenous peoples, only to contaminate white people later on. The paranoia surrounding sex between black and white Virginians motivated the barring of interracial sex. Another 1924 law started the sterilization of white women for producing children who were classified as non-white. Once passed, indigenous people had to negotiate their identity in stressful interviews with government officials who were intent on scrutinizing their intimate lives to protect segregation, particularly in schools and marriage. Some Chickahominy people had their birth certificates edited by Plecker himself to emphasize their non-white ancestry, and their identities changed in the process. People in disposition found that change pretty embarrassing. Even Plecker himself actually met with different indigenous groups around Virginia to tell them the differences in their blood makeup and to notify them that those who were at that point afterwards considered to be people of color were no longer able to have marriages with white women. A Pamunkey chief says that he would rather die than be classified as a quote, Negro, and it shows how Pamunkey people deeply resented the legislation and attempted to make it even stricter. Additionally, some indigenous peoples protested outside the General Assembly by wearing, quote, department store regalia, and brought their own lawyers and disavowed any connection to, and they disavowed any connection to black people, which drew the ire of white people who emphasized the intersex of black and native peoples. Even ordinary people resisted the ruling by exaggerating their indigeneity in ways that white people would recognize. By lumping them in with people of color, white people could oppress them in the same ways. White officials recognized that native peoples aggressively resisted the eugenics program passed through law, and that restrictive laws like these were risky because of that. They showed a reluctant admission of the power of indigenous people. Okay, blood quantum theory. So blood quantum as encoded in legislation is certainly one thing, but how actual people process bloodline as an indicator of race turns out to be quite another thing. As late as 1966 in Lumberton, blood quantum theory has preserved its scientificness, but the Bible is now also cited as reasons for racial hierarchies in Robeson County. As before, if biology was the determinant of racial identity on paper, it was nevertheless useless as a kind of metric for race in practice. According to Karen Blue, white people in the 60s Robesons thought that the race of a person depended upon their biological parents, but in practice it was social parents or one's kin that determined one's race, not biological parents. Interestingly, the same people believe that white people in the county think that different races have different facial features that tell you the blood of each person. So your facial features will tell you, or at least tell Robeson County white people in the 60s what racial blood they had. And yet, so it kind of seems like blood and stereotypical physical features are not alternatives. They're very much intermixed with each other and they go hand in hand. And yet, both of these metrics for race are utterly useless in determining one's race in Robeson County, and the Lumbee people know this best. Despite the scientific nature of blood quantum, one is left guessing about racial identity. So confident in their ability to know someone's race just by looking at them, white Robesonians said that they could tell someone's race just by looking at the color of their skin, when factually, the Lumbee people knew this not to actually be the case. And despite these quick signs that allowed white people to determine the race of others, even for Lumbees, the determination of someone's race was actually a much subtler process than one might appreciate. Surnames actually tend to be the best indicator of Lumbee ancestry, with other traits like, quote, dialect, mannerisms, bearing, carriage, and gestures, end quote, and the people with whom one associates all come to bear on how one is perceived. The key here is that without knowing one's parents, and because these traits are so dependent, one's perceived race is always going to be in flux in Robeson County. Given the litany of policies and attitudes that oppressed southeastern indigenous peoples by comparing them with black people, it is not surprising that they developed a strong anti-blackness slant as a coping mechanism. Starting in the antebellum period, the Lumbees detested being called, quote, mulattoes, and found it highly insulting to be called the N-word. And even today, the Lumbees hate being called Croatan or mestizo, mulatto, mixed blood, etc., any implication that they are not fully Lumbee indigenous people. And they hate all this because in the South, all of these terms denote blackness, which is important to avoid because of how many years the Lumbees spent avoiding people of color. And we'll talk about that sort of in the back half of this presentation. And yet, even as better treatment is what the Lumbee people wanted, and they had grown so tired of the taunts of their oppressors, they had less desire to become white, even as if they were white, they might receive better treatment. Lumbees even have the label white Indian to describe Lumbee people who, quote, act like whites and are said to be, quote, not really Indian. And so it is unsurprising that so few Lumbee people so few Lumbee people chose to pass as white, even when that's absolutely what they could do. It was not only the Lumbee, but among the Pamunkey too, because even as Lucy and William Scott could have identified as indigenous people, Lucy emphasized in a letter to her daughter the importance of acquiring literacy and avoiding black people as she traveled north, for fear of being seen around black people and thus considered to be black herself. The Cherokee had somewhat of a similar response as the Lumbee, but it grew much more militant in the 1820s, during the development of the new Central Cherokee government. In a time when their sovereignty was under threat by the United States, the Cherokee government sought to save itself by making itself more like America to avoid the suspicion of the American military. And so they, quote, solidified the identity of their republic through the definition and regulation of racial categories. For them, that meant that they passed legislation that restricted interactions between black and mixed-race Afro-Cherokee people, and embedding in its constitution a distinct category of blackness. Any Cherokee person who had African ancestry was barred from political participation entirely, and was not entitled to rights. Free black people were literally known as intruders in the Cherokee territory at this time, in this new wave of Cherokee government. And while white men and women were not viewed as Cherokee citizens, they were still allowed to have unions with Cherokee people, and their children could be considered citizens, where no such provisions were there for people of color. Any person who touched African ancestry was now, at this point, considered an outsider. While stopping short of endorsing slavery, the Cherokee Constitution of the 1820s made no provisions for slavery, but they did ensure that masters were responsible for their slaves by making masters culpable for any wrongdoings that their slaves did. They ordered a police force to ensure slave compliance. They prevented slaves from owning property, which was something they could do before. They could inherit property. Blocked any black people from entry into the territory. And basically it upholded a punitive form of slavery, and it made claims to civilization that would have been convincing to white Americans for their manner of extracting profit from forced laborers. And so basically what the Cherokee people are doing is, by creating a slave economy, they're trying to make themselves look more like the United States. And this was all part of their civilizing process, and if they could progress, then they would not have to face a state takeover. All right. But at the same time, but because they excluded black people from their territory, the Cherokee could claim to separate itself from black people and thus gain the trappings of whiteness. Crucially, the Cherokee Nation adopted the draconian slave economy of the South not because they wanted to emulate the United States, because they felt like they had to. They didn't want to be seen as backwards by American politicians. And this was their way of avoiding the colonization that they feared would happen. Slave restrictions became much more severe when Cherokee were forced along the Trail of Tears. Slaves were not allowed education, reading, and writing as they were before, and they could be killed for sexual assault of any woman except for black women, and outlawing marriage between black people and Cherokee people. All right. So recall from the start of the lesson when I mentioned Shoe Boots, the famous Cherokee warrior who took as his wife and slave an African woman whose name was Doll. What you're looking at right now on the left-hand side is an image of the petition that Shoe Boots submitted to liberate his three eldest children and to make them citizens. I took a screenshot of the image and put it here. You can also find it on page 244 of Miles's book, and the original document is contained at the University of Oklahoma. So without trying to decipher his handwriting too much, his letter was sent in 1824, and it's somewhat of an exercise in self-depreciation and apology. By this time in Cherokee history, it is the 1820s, it was considered nearly criminal for a Cherokee person to have a child with a black person. And Shoe Boots, no doubt aware of this change in social expectations, sort of takes on this different tenor. And he admits that he, quote, debased himself and was, quote, crossed in his affections by having sex with Doll, his wife and slave, but at the same time expresses his wish that it would crush him to see his children given away as property rather than being able to take on full personhood and citizenship. At this time, the chances might have looked grim for Shoe Boots when he submitted the petition, but at the same time, Cherokee members did sometimes violate their own rules in order to kind of keep the peace and to show that they still valued kinship as the variable along which racial identity was constructed. So they sometimes broke their own rules about barring black people from citizenship, including slaves, and so when Shoe Boots submits his petition, because he had known Doll so long ago, they had gotten together so long ago before the 1820s, his plea was actually accepted in the end, although it was accepted with much reluctance, as shown on the right-hand picture. The right-hand picture basically is a ruling that comes down from the Cherokee Council that says we will liberate your children, they will become Cherokee citizens, but we really need you to understand that this is absolutely not okay, and that we're making an exception for you, and that we're under no obligation to give your children this rights. So it's pretty begrudgingly that the state allows this to happen. All right. In contrast, the descendants of Shoeboots and Doll, such as Mary, the daughter of John Shoeboots, who's the eldest son of Doll and Shoeboots, and William, who's the youngest son of Doll and Shoeboots, were not accepted for citizenship, unlike the other children, because they couldn't prove that they had Cherokee ancestry because they had married African-American women too late. And this was it was because of a policy called the Dawes Rolls, okay, in which the list of Cherokee citizenship was assembled by the federal government, and it prevented Cherokee people who had married African Americans from official marriage, from official membership in the Cherokee. So, no matter your ancestry, as soon as you marry someone who is black, you have your one drop, and so you're not a Cherokee person anymore. Because the Dawes Roll took away the power of the Cherokee Nation to decide who were citizens and transferred that ability to U.S. government, the federal government could effectively decide which people of color were able to get land, relying as they did on blood quantum rules that excluded black people from Native identity in all its forms. And so when the U.S. government commanded in 1887 that the Cherokees, as well as the, quote, Creeks, Choctaws, Chickasaws, and Seminoles, to divide their lands into plots that individual property owners among their members could use, despite that land being held in common before, in what's called the General Allotment Act, all of their land is split up and given to members, especially white landowners. And as non-citizens of the nation, Afro-Cherokee people and people of color are not able to get that land. So not only does the Cherokee Nation disenfranchise Afro-Cherokee people and slaves and free people of color, but then Plecker and his sort of gang of eugenicists are able to decide who partakes in Cherokee membership, and you know that they're going to use blood quantum as their criteria. In his petition, Shoeboots appealed to what he knew had long been the true essence of Cherokee identity prior to 1920, which wasn't bloodline, but kinship structure. Unlike the present moment, which threatened the existence of people of both Cherokee and black identities, and before the reestablishment of the centralized Cherokee state when slaves lost social standing, that wasn't because they were black, but because they were isolated from kinship networks, and this is shown in the example of Doll. So Doll, for example, was an African slave. She was not part of a kinship network to begin with, and that's why she was very much isolated in the Cherokee community. So she was not part of a kinship community, but she did have access to some of the fittings of Cherokee women. There are some reports that she wore earrings and clothing that Cherokee women had access to. But on secondhand accounts of her blackness is still emphasized in spite of these cultural transfers. Additionally, an elaborate patchwork of rituals and ceremonies accompanied childbearing pregnancy for Cherokee women, but Doll, in her sole record of giving birth to her first child, was labeled as a, quote, Negro. The only way that black people entered kinship networks, if not through marriage, was by way of adoption. So they had to be adopted by Cherokee people in order to enter these kinship networks. One record details information about a slave named Molly, who was given by a white man named Dent to her clan as a way of making amends for killing his wife. But when another white person tried to claim Molly back, the Deer clan, Molly's clan, filed a lawsuit. And they said that Molly, they gave her a name, it was Chickahua, or sister. They protected her from slavery. So by way of adoption, Molly was able to be safeguarded by her kinship network from a return back into slavery. In our next part, we're going to get to some of the ways that that Cherokee people, Lumbee people, and Powhatan people resisted these kinds of disadvantages and these forms of oppression that affected all of them.